She knocked at his door, but it was the cross at her throat that froze his blood colder than a Rocky Mountain dawn. One quiet autumn evening in the San Miguel Basin, an old rancher sat at his table, always setting two bowls, one for himself, one for a memory that wouldn't let go. When the dusk stretched across the porch and a knock sounded at his door, he couldn't know that opening it would dig up grief long buried, spark-old promises and force every battered heart inside that house to face what none had dared to speak. The hope of staying, even if only together. The wind had been rattling the cottonwoods all day, dry and whispering, shaking the red dust against the porch steps of Dry Arrow Ranch. Whit McCrae stood inside his kitchen, fork in hand, one boot off, the other halfway unlaced. Two bowls sat on the worn pine table, though he only ever filled one. Habit dies hard, even when the memory bites deeper than the wind. He was still chewing cold beans when the first knock came, a quick, sharp rap that sounded like a pebble flung by a child, or maybe a warning. He set the fork down slow, listening for a voice. Sometimes coyotes would nose the stoop. Sometimes it was only the wind slapping the loose boards. But then the knock came again, louder, no mistaking it for beast or wind. Whit pulled his old hat off the post, shoved his foot into the stiff leather boot, and crossed to the door. He opened it to the scent of dry sage, dusk bleeding purple over the valley, and a girl standing barefoot in the dust. She looked young at first, then old somehow, all at once. Her dress was a plain brown that hung to her ankles, arms red and raw from the sun, a threadbare scarf tied snug under her chin. She gripped the strap of a faded sack as if it were a lifeline. Whit watched her eyes. It was the only thing that hadn't been worn out by the miles. "Evening," she said, her voice rough, tired, but not weak. "I heard you might need a cook." No introduction, no please, just that. Whit felt a strange weight fill the air, heavy with things unsaid. He nodded, the way a man does when the world's already changed before he found his words. "You hungry?" he asked. "Some." She stepped up on the porch, glancing once over her shoulder like she'd run the whole way from yesterday. He held the door, watched her limp inside. The room was half dark, fire low in the stove, beans and bacon fat still clinging to the air. She set her sack down by the hearth, stooped to retie a bootlace, and that's when it happened. A silver cross slipped from her collar, swinging on a thin, blackened chain. Whit's heart stuttered in his chest. Not just a cross, the cross. Bent on the left arm, stamped rough along the bottom edge. He knew it as sure as he knew. The smell of rain after months of dust. His hand trembled at his side. For a second, all he saw was snow falling through the window 10 years ago. A girl's feet pounding the boards as she ran. Breath white in the air, cross bouncing against her chest. Nell, gone before dawn, and not a trace left but her boots by the door. The wind keened through a crack in the wall. The woman straightened, caught him staring. "You all right?" she asked, not gentle but honest, and it was the honesty that brought him back to the present. "Yeah," he muttered, "come on in." She didn't look around, didn't make small talk. Just rolled up her sleeves, pushed back a few wayward strands of hair, and started toward the stove. "Can make stew if you got salt and fat." He nodded, still staring. "You got a name?" A pause, like the question pinched somewhere it shouldn't. "June," she said finally. "June Hart." She didn't offer a last name, or maybe Hart was the lie. He didn't push. Some wounds, you prod and they fester. Instead, he watched her cut turnips, fingers deft, too quick for someone her age. The cross flashed again as she worked, a silent threat. Or a blessing? Whit couldn't tell. He found himself holding his breath, the old ache inside him flaring to life. By the time the beans boiled and the bread baked, dusk had bled fully into night. June served him first, then herself. She sat on the floor by the hearth, not asking for a chair, not asking for anything at all. He laid a blanket over the bench beside her before heading to his own room. The only sound was the low pop of embers and the lonesome moan of wind around the eaves. For a while he didn't sleep. He listened for footsteps in the kitchen, for the old ghost of hope, wondering if maybe by some cruel grace what was lost had finally found its way home. He woke before first light, an old habit honed by storms, debt, and the cattle's unpredictable ways. The sky beyond the window was gunmetal, but the kitchen glowed faint and gold. June was already there, her hair in a rough braid, sleeves rolled, a small fire snapping in the stove. She moved about the kitchen with the silent energy of someone who had learned not to waste it, cracking eggs, slicing onions with quick, businesslike hands. Whit stood a moment in the doorway, unseen. It struck him how natural she looked there, how she seemed to fit in the hush of dawn, as if she'd always known the shape of this old house. He coughed to announce himself. She didn't startle, just glanced over her shoulder and nodded once. "Coffee's on," she said. "I've found some bacon. Hope you don't mind." He didn't. The smell, smoky and warm, curled through the room and settled into the bones. For a while they ate in near silence. Whit watched the way she sat, back straight, knees drawn up close, hands never quite relaxing. He thought of Nell again, of little habits that never left a person. When June reached for the salt, he noticed the faintest bruise on her wrist, the kind left by a hard grip and time. He said nothing. "You from around here?" he asked instead, his voice a little softer. She shook her head. "No, sir. South. Kept heading north as far as my feet would take me." Whit tried to catch her eyes, but she kept them down. He let it drop. June chewed her bacon slow, then nodded to the window. "Storm's coming," she said. "I can smell it." He could too, the dry, bitter edge of dust and lightning somewhere beyond the basin. By mid-morning, the wind had picked up. Whit saddled his old bay, checked the fences. June hung laundry and tended to the chores without being asked, humming a tune under her breath, low and wistful. Something about the melody snagged Whit in the ribs, a lullaby nearly forgotten. He couldn't recall the words, but the feeling was as sharp as any memory. He paused at the barn door, watching as June worked, the cross at her throat catching a glint of pale sun. A rider passed out on the road too far to see clearly, but the dust he kicked up lingered long after he was gone. Whit tensed. Trouble had a way of traveling faster than the mail. When he came back to the house, June had made a pot of beans and left him a clean plate at the table. 2 bowls, just as before. He almost smiled. That evening, after chores, Whit sat on the porch with his boots up and a battered tin cup of coffee warming his palms. June swept the kitchen, then leaned on the door frame, looking out at the sunset. "You ever lose something and spend half your life waiting for it to come back?" she asked, voice small, words almost lost in the wind. Whit nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I have." They watched the red settle in over the hills. The silence stretched, but not empty. He wanted to ask about the cross, where she got it, why it made his hands shake. He wanted to ask about the bruises, about the song, but he didn't. Some things need time, he thought. Some questions, if you ask them too soon, you lose the answer forever. As night fell, June slipped inside, the soft click of the door closing behind her. Whit lingered on the porch, staring at the empty land, feeling the old ache rise up like a warning and a promise. Both. He wondered if hope could stand another storm, or if maybe, just maybe, it had finally come home with a stranger's boots on his doorstep. Dust blew in sideways that afternoon, gritty and mean, turning the sky the color of tarnished copper. Whit leaned into the wind, coat buttoned tight, watching the clouds twist across the basin. He checked the herd twice, counted every calf by memory, making sure nothing was lost to the coming storm. There was an edge in the air he hadn't felt since the winter his father died. Something in the way the clouds moved, how the wind rattled every loose hinge in the barn. He found June at the well, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a wash bucket full of water and soap at her feet. She scrubbed at a shirt, his shirt, the one he'd left draped over the corral gate 2 days back. Her hands worked the fabric hard, knuckles white, as if she could scour away more than just dust and sweat. She didn't look up as he approached. Whit watched her for a moment, noticed how she kept her body turned, her eyes always glancing to the horizon. Not afraid exactly, but wary, like an animal that's seen a trap once and survived. He helped her haul the bucket inside. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. The old dog followed them in, shaking the dust off his coat with a grunt. June smiled, just barely, and tossed him a scrap of bread. Whit thought about how small mercies make a place feel like home, and how quick they can disappear. Later, the mail came in with the wind. A thin letter stamped from Ure, the banker's mark on the front. Whit turned it over in his hands, feeling the familiar ache crawl up his spine. He opened it with the knife he carried everywhere and read the words slow. If the herd didn't come in full by the end of the month, the land was gone. Sold up, likely to one of the Montrose men, maybe Rutledge himself. He set the letter down, hands trembling. June watched him, quiet. She didn't ask, just waited. "Trouble?" she said at last. Whit nodded, the sound of it too heavy in the small kitchen. "It's always trouble out here," he muttered. The sky darkened early, the air gone still and sharp. As the first drops of rain began to patter the roof, June moved to the window, peering out. A shape moved near the far fence line, a rider, dark coat, wide-brimmed hat low over his face. The horse moved slow, purposeful, June's stiffened hand going to the cross at her neck. Whit's jaw tightened. He fetched the old rifle from behind the stove, just in case. The stranger didn't stop, only rode past the boundary and vanished into the falling rain. Whit watched long after he'd gone, heart pounding in a way he didn't care to name. "You know him?" he asked, glancing at June. She shook her head, too quickly. "No, sir." But her eyes never left the window, and her hand never left the cross. That night, with the wind and rain beating at the house, Whit heard June humming again. Same tune as before, soft and half-broken. He listened, wondering if maybe some songs get passed down like old wounds, something that never quite heals. He sat at the table with his coffee, letter from the bank weighing down the edge. For the first time in years, he felt something flicker, fear or hope or both, mixed with the storm. He didn't ask her anything more, didn't mention the rider or the bruises or the way the cross seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. He just let her finish the song, watched her clean the knives, listened to the rain. In the stillness, he felt the world shifting again, slow as dusk, fierce as thunder, the kind of change that slips in before a man knows how much he's got left to lose. The next morning, wind had blown the storm out east, leaving behind a sky so clear it hurt the eyes. Whit woke to the smell of wood smoke and biscuits, and the sharp clang of the pump outside. He found June in the yard, apron stained, hair coming loose in the morning sun. She looked smaller without the shadows, but the set of her jaw was all hard bone and will. He moved to help her, but she only shook her head, motioning him inside. "Breakfast'll be ready soon," she said. Whit left her to it, old pride still stinging from the fact he'd come to rely on another soul in his house. He set about his chores, feeding the mare, checking the barn doors, tightening the wire along the south fence. It was near the well, boots sinking in mud from last night's rain, that he spotted something new, a set of hoof prints, deep and sharp, too fresh to be from any of his own. The prints were odd, one shoe clipped and bent in a way that caught his attention. Whit squatted down, touching the mark. That wasn't any neighbor, and it sure as hell wasn't a friendly passerby. He felt the prickling at the back of his neck, the old instinct warning that trouble had taken an interest. Back in the house, he found June folding linen with the slow care of someone raised with little. Whit set his hat on the table, fixing her with a look. "Had a writer come through last night," he said. "You see him?" She didn't answer, didn't even pause her folding. "No, sir," she replied after a beat. "Just the storm." He watched her. How her eyes darted, how her hands gripped the cloth tight. He let it be. They ate in silence. Whit's mind wandered to the letter from Ouray, to the land he might lose, to the memory of Nell, his sister, her laughter echoing from a time before the world grew hard. Every so often June's cross would catch the light, flicker silver against her throat. He found himself wanting to ask, wanting to shake answers loose, but stopping short. It was fear, or maybe hope, holding his tongue. Late in the day, as the heat slipped away, another knock rattled the door. This time it was heavy, deliberate, a fist made of bone and warning. Whit answered, rifle leaning against the wall, just out of sight. On the step stood a man built wide and mean, one eye marked by a jagged scar, chewing something bitter and dark. Behind him waited another, younger, a sly kind of hunger in his smile. The first man held out a folded paper, red seal pressed hard into the page. "Afternoon," he said, voice scraping over the words. "Name's Harlan Briggs. This here's Macklin. We're looking for a girl. Goes by June Hart. Run off from Montrose way." His gaze slid past Whit into the house. "She in there?" Whit met his eyes, slow and calm. "I hire who I please," he said, not raising his voice. "Don't recall asking Montrose for permission." Briggs shrugged, rolling the paper between thick fingers. "Ain't about permission, mister. It's about property. Judge says she owes. We collect. Simple." He shoved the paper forward. Whit took it, feeling the weight of the law and the stink of something dirtier underneath. Inside, June stood frozen near the hearth, eyes locked on the seal. Whit read enough to know it was trouble, a writ of recovery, stamped by the local judge, paid for by men like Rutledge. The cross at June's neck clicked softly against the tin spoon she gripped in her fist. Whit looked up at Briggs, not blinking. "No one here by that name," he said. "You best move along." For a second, Briggs looked ready to push, but something in Whit's stare made him reconsider. He spat in the dust, glancing at Macklin, then tipped his hat, false polite. "We'll be back. Sun sets fast out here." Whit shut the door, paper still in hand, heart pounding. June had not moved, her whole body held tight as a bow. He saw her fingers white around the spoon, saw her lips trembling, but silent. He didn't say a word, just tossed the writ into the fire and watched it curl, blacken, and vanish in the flame. For a long time after, the only sound in the house was the ticking of the old clock and the breath each of them held, waiting for the other to let go first. The world shrank to a hush that night. Whit set the lamp low and watched June sit by the fire, her knees drawn to her chest, cross grip so tight the chain cut red lines into her palm. He made a show of tending the stove, giving her space, pretending not to notice the way she flinched at every creak and groan in the old house. Outside, the wind sang a high, lonely song through the cottonwoods, scattering dry leaves across the porch. Somewhere up the valley, thunder growled, rolling far off but promising to return. Whit remembered nights just like this, waiting for something bad to knock, or for someone lost to walk through the door. He wondered which would come first. He tried sleep but found none. Sometime past midnight he heard June's voice, low and wavering, a song, almost a lullaby, familiar and sad. He closed his eyes, letting the tune tug him backward in time, to Nell, her braids swinging, laughing as she spun circles on the old kitchen floor, singing that very same melody until the sky turned pink. It was enough to make a grown man ache. At first light, Whit rose, boots heavy on the floor. June was gone. Only the faintest print of her small feet in the dust by the door, a dish towel folded careful on the table. He found a scrap of paper, her writing tight and sharp. Sorry, don't follow. Whit snatched up his hat, heart pounding, fear sour in his gut. He followed the trail, bare toes in the dirt, scuffed earth along the arroyo, a patch of calico, snagged on a thorn bush. Out by the edge of Devil's Cut, a narrow ravine where the sun never quite reached, he spotted a flash of blue skirt and the battered boots that had been hanging by the back door since she arrived. He crouched low, scanning the rocks. Up ahead, voices, rough, mean, Briggs and Macklin. They had June by the arms, dragging her uphill. She fought, spitting curses, the cross at her neck flashing like a dare. Whit crept closer, moving the way his father taught him, silent, steady. He lined up the old Winchester, hands sweating, heart beating so loud he thought the men must hear it. Macklin turned, just a hair too late. Whit squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked the morning open, echoing down the rocks. Macklin dropped, rolling in the dirt, screaming. Briggs lunged for June, but Whit charged, clubbing him with the butt of the rifle. They crashed together, teeth and elbows, dirt in the mouth, blood hot in the nose. Briggs swung wild, catching Whit's jaw, but Whit didn't let go. He'd been waiting a decade for a fight that mattered. He slammed Briggs' head to the ground and pressed the barrel to his chest. "You leave her be! You hear me?" Briggs spat blood, eyes wild. "You got no idea who you're messing with. Rutledge owns this whole county." Whit shoved him aside, grabbing June, holding her tight as she shivered. June's breath rattled. "Whit," she whispered, "is it really you?" Her voice cracked on the edge of his name, a plea, a prayer. He nodded, choking on words he hadn't said in 10 years. "It's me, Nell. You're home." Briggs crawled away, muttering curses, promising to come back. Whit didn't care. He cradled Nell. No longer June, not a stranger anymore, as she wept into his shirt, tears scalding and old as the land itself. The wind howled through Devil's Cut, but for the first time in years, Whit wasn't afraid. He'd found what was lost, and that was enough to hold off the storm, for now. They made their way home, slow, the long way around, slipping through gullies and sage, avoiding the road. Whit kept an eye on the ridge behind them, but the only thing that followed was the morning sun, stretching gold over the high pasture. Nell walked with a limp, one boot nearly torn off, face streaked with dust and tears. She leaned into Whit when she stumbled, the cross pressed close to her throat. He wished he could carry every mile for her, but some burdens a person has to bear on their own. At the house, Whit helped her inside, lowering her gently onto the bench beside the stove. He found the old tin of salve, hands shaking as he dabbed it on the bruises blooming along her wrists. She winced but didn't pull away. Her eyes were red but clearer now, as if some deep fever had finally broken. He ladled water from the pot, offered it to her. "You hurt bad?" he asked. Nell shook her head. "Not bad, just tired." She cradled the mug, staring into the steam. "I ran so long I forgot what stopping felt like." Whit sat across from her, elbows on knees, searching for words. "You can stay. No one will take you off this land, not while I breathe." He meant it, every word. She looked up at him, mouth trembling. "You don't know what you're saying, Whit. Rutledge, Briggs, they got the law on their side. They say I'm property." Her voice almost broke on the last word. You're my blood. That's more than any law." He said it like an oath, old and simple. Nell fell quiet. For a long time, the only sound was the kettle spitting on the stove, the hiss of wind against the shutters. Whit remembered a dozen nights just like this. Fire burning low, 2 bowls on the table, a silence too heavy for words. But this time, the second bowl wasn't for memory. It was for someone alive. As evening settled, Whit busied himself with chores, keeping his hands moving to keep the worry down. Nell sat in the yard, back against the porch post, eyes closed to the last rays of sun. She hummed the lullaby again, softer now, a song full of loss and longing. He watched from the barn, unseen, feeling something break and mend in his chest all at once. After supper they sat together by the fire. Nell told him pieces, never the whole, but enough. How she'd been traded, run down, hidden in sheds and barns, sold from house to house until she forgot which way was north. How the only thing she kept was the cross and the song. Whit listened, jaw tight, every word a cut. He took in silence. "Why'd you come here?" he asked finally, voice rough. She shrugged, pulling the old quilt over her knees. "Didn't know where else to go. Just remembered the shape of this house. Remembered your voice." She looked at him sideways, tears shining in the firelight. "I was afraid you'd be gone." Whit reached for her hand, found it cold but steady. "I ain't going anywhere," he said. Sleep came easy for her that night, curled on the bench, firelight flickering across her face. Whit stayed awake, rifle across his lap, watching the shadows crawl along the walls. He'd made a promise, old as blood and bone, and out here promises had to mean something. He thought of Briggs, of Rutledge, of the law twisting like a snake in the grass. He thought of the old wound, finally found and mended, at least for a night. And as the wind dropped and the land went quiet, he let himself believe, just for a heartbeat, that maybe, just maybe, they could stay whole this time. By morning, news had traveled farther than any horse. The sun wasn't all the way up when Whit heard wagon wheels crunching over the gravel. Then the metallic bark of a bell at the ranch gate. He looked out and saw a buckboard drawn by 2 bay mules. Mr. Cobb sitting tall in a black suit too fine for this dust, hat wide and shadowing a pinched face. 2 deputies rode behind him, hands easy near their guns, badges flashing like sharp teeth in the morning light. Nell was still sleeping in the warm spill of dawn across the floor. Whit left her there, tucking the quilt around her shoulders, then went to meet whatever trouble had come riding up. Cobb stepped down, wiping his boots as if the dirt itself might stain him. "Mr. McCrae," he called, voice smooth as creek ice. "Judge sent me, got papers." He nodded to the deputies. They dismounted slow, glancing at the house, the barn, the hills beyond. Whit watched them all, counting the ways a day can turn bad. "State your business," Whit said, voice like gravel. Cobb produced a folded stack, heavy with red seals and signatures. "Here's a writ, stamped legal and true. States a runaway female known as June Hart, a.k.a. Ellen McCrae, is to be returned as property to the Rutledge estate. This land, by association, may be forfeit if you refuse compliance." The words slid out oily and final. Whit took the papers, feeling the bile rise. "This here's a home, not a market. You come for her, you'll answer to me." Cobb looked him up and down, lips pressed thin. "We'll come again with the law in hand and a judge at our back. You got till sundown tomorrow to comply." One of the deputies, lean and nervous, spat in the dirt and muttered, "Ain't worth fightin' over a lost cause, mister." Whit just stared, cold as a winter dawn, until they turned back to their mounts. Cobb paused at the gate. "Be wise, McCrae. Rutledge men don't lose. Not out here." Whit watched them ride off, dust trailing behind like a warning. He folded the writ, tucking it inside his coat, feeling the weight of it, heavy as chain. Back inside, Nell was awake, sitting cross-legged on the bench, hair a wild tangle, eyes shadowed but alert. She'd heard every word through the thin walls. She looked at him, then at the fire, her hand drifting up to her cross. "They'll come for me," she whispered, "and you'll lose everything if you try to keep me." Her voice was steady, but something small flickered in her eyes, a terror so old and worn it had its own shape. Whit knelt beside her. "You're not leaving, not unless you want to. I've lost enough." He looked her in the eye, searching for the girl he remembered. "This is your home, Nell. You got a right to stay." She shook her head, voice almost gone. "No one's ever stayed for me." Whit took her hand in his, calloused and rough. "I'm stayin' hell or high water." For the rest of the day they worked side by side, mending the maize fence, splitting wood, checking the livestock. Nell moved through the tasks with a quiet resolve, her mouth set, her eyes never far from the hills. Whit watched her and felt something old and proud rise in his chest. The land could be lost, the law could be bent, but some things, a name, a promise, a place at the table, were too sacred to surrender. That night, as darkness settled, Whit cleaned the old shotgun and set it by the door. Nell curled up near the fire, her face turned toward the embers, her cross shining in the flicker. Outside, the wind had stilled, but he knew calm never lasted long in these parts. Whit sat watch while she slept, listening for hoofbeats in the distance, heart steady. Whatever storm was coming, he was done running. Sometimes the only way to keep what matters is to stand and take the hit. Nell rose before the light, careful not to wake Whit where he'd fallen asleep in his chair, hat low over his eyes, shotgun resting against his knee. She set about the kitchen, silent as a shadow, her hands sure and steady as she packed a bundle of cornbread and dried apples in a kerchief. For a moment she lingered at the window, watching the world shift from blue to gold. In that hush, she let herself imagine a different life, one where the knock at the door was only a neighbor, not the start of a hunt. She left a note on the table, her words small and sharp. "Tell him I'm sorry. It's better this way." Then she slipped out, boots soft on the earth, making for the thin light where the land fell open toward the flats. She moved quick and quiet, a habit too deep to break. Whit woke to the emptiness, the ache in his chest as familiar as the sun rising. The note lay on the table beside the cold coffee, and for a minute he couldn't breathe. He found her tracks easy, barely a print in the dew-soaked earth, heading east, then turning south, toward the distant shimmer of the Llano Estacado. He saddled the bay without a word, the dog trailing after, nose to the wind. He caught up by noon. Nell crouched behind a wagon wheel at the crossing, her dress soaked from the river, shoulders shaking with cold. She didn't turn as he approached, but he saw the way her back stiffened. "You weren't supposed to follow," she said, voice frayed thin. Whit dropped his coat around her shoulders, kneeling in the dirt beside her. "You don't get to choose alone," he answered, soft but firm. "I ain't letting you carry this by yourself." She wanted to protest. He could see it in the way her jaw clenched, the way her fists balled up in the fabric of her skirt, but the fight had gone out of her. "They'll ruin you, Whit. They'll take everything you got, everything you built." He shook his head, eyes fierce. "I'd lose it all twice for you. Ain't nothing left if I let you go." A single shot cracked across the plain, warning, not meant to kill. Whit spun, gun drawn, but there was Cade Mercer at the ridge, silent as always, his Sharps rifle steady, hat pulled low. Cade rode down, boots thudding in the dust. He nodded to Whit, then looked at Nell. "Heard trouble was circling, figured I'd best keep an eye out." He didn't offer more, didn't need to. In his presence, the air changed, less lonely, less afraid. Nell met his gaze and didn't look away. For the first time since she'd run, she didn't feel small. The three of them rode back slow, sticking to the narrow trails. Cade rode ahead, his shadow long and sure. Nell watched him, a silent question in her eyes. Whit caught her looking and managed a half-smile. "He's a good one. Never says more'n he has to, but he's got your back. Same as me." That night, with 3 plates at the table and the wind settling outside, the house felt less haunted, more like home. Nell sat across from Cade, her eyes tired but brighter, and something in her posture had shifted. Shoulders back, head high. Whit noticed, and so did Cade, though he only gave a small nod. Later, as the fire burned low, Whit caught Nell standing at the window, looking out into the dark. "You think we'll ever be safe?" she asked, not turning. "Safe don't last out here," he answered, "but you got folks who'll stand with you. That's what matters." In the quiet that followed, Nell let herself believe it. For just one night, she let herself belong, not as a runaway, not as someone's property, but as kin, as family. And with Cade keeping watch outside and Whit cleaning his gun by the fire, the old house stood firm against whatever the dawn might bring. The morning broke with a thin rain, gray and gentle, soaking the land and softening the hard edges of everything. Whit was in the barn, mending tack, when Cade rode in from the north line, his coat slick and dark with water. "Company comin'," Cade said, voice flat. Not just the Rutledge men this time. They brought papers, sheriff's seal. He tossed a glance toward the house, eyes hard as creekstone. Whit wiped his hands and followed him to the porch. Nell was already there, hair damp from the mist, shoulders squared, the cross shining at her throat. The wagon rolled to a stop just beyond the gate. Cobb, the lawyer, at the reins, 3 deputies behind, and a man Whit hadn't seen before. Judge Beaumont himself, black robe catching the rain, a look on his face that said he'd rather be anywhere else. Beaumont stepped down first, boots sinking in the red clay. He nodded to Whit, barely polite, then held up a sheaf of papers wrapped in oilskin. "Mr. McCrae," he said, "I'm here to enforce the writ, harboring a fugitive, Ellen McCrae, alias June Hart. If you persist, you forfeit this land. It's the law." Whit stood tall, shoulders broad, calm in the face of the judge's threat. "Her name's Nell. She was stolen. I've got proof. Cross is marked, matches church record at San Isidro. You want justice, look there, not in the Rutledge ledger." Beaumont frowned, uneasy. He glanced at Cobb, who looked everywhere but at Whit's face. Cade stepped forward, standing just behind Whit's left shoulder. "You'll have to go through all of us," he said, voice even, rifle slung easy but loaded. Nell stepped out, bare feet on the porch, dress clinging to her legs from the rain. "I'll speak for myself," she called, voice ringing clear as a bell. She held up the cross, fingers steady despite the tremor in her jaw. "This land is mine as much as his. I was baptized with this. My name's in the church book. Ask Reverend Pike. You take me, you do it knowing the truth." For a moment, nobody moved. The deputies shifted in their saddles. Cobb looked at his boots. Judge Beaumont blinked water from his eyes. Whit's hand hovered near his hip, but didn't move. Cade watched the ridge, silent but ready. A single rider appeared on the hill, then another, then 3 more, then a dozen. All on horseback, all wearing the scars and grit of men who'd seen too much of the Rutledge way. Old bondsmen, freedmen, the ones Nell had helped feed when she herself had nothing. They lined up on the crest, rifles raised, silent but certain. Judge Beaumont looked from the armed men to Whit, then to Nell. "This is irregular," he muttered, "but there's enough here for a hearing." He folded the papers, tucking them away. "No one's leaving today. We'll sort it in Santa Fe." With that, he turned and climbed back into the wagon. Deputies following, Cobb looking green about the gills. As the rain eased, the riders tipped their hats and melted back into the hills. The kind of silent promise you only get once in a lifetime. Whit let out a long, shaking breath. Cade clapped him on the shoulder, then vanished toward the barn. Nell stood alone on the porch, face tilted up into the last drops, eyes shining with something like hope and something like sorrow. Whit watched her, thinking how sometimes a name and a piece of land were the only things a person had to call their own, and how both had to be fought for, again and again. The rain lingered through the morning, the world quieted under a gray sky that felt heavy enough to press down memories. Nell busied herself with chores, sweeping the kitchen, scrubbing the old kettle, tying onions up in strings near the window. Whit watched her from the doorway, sensing the storm inside her was fiercer than anything the clouds could muster. At midday, Cade showed up with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, his boots dripping on the stoop. He held it out to Nell without a word. She peeled it open slow, fingers shaking, and found a letter, brittle and stained, the envelope stamped with Missouri Post, and the name Martha Jane McCrae scrawled in a hand she hadn't seen since childhood. Nell froze, the color draining from her face. Cade stepped back, giving her space, while Whit hovered behind, uncertain. She opened the letter, eyes racing the lines. If you're alive, I never stopped praying. I searched for you through every storm. Come home if you can. You were born under a new moon. You sang to the barn cats. Her mother's words spilled like balm and salt together. She pressed the paper to her lips, shaking, tears burning but not falling. Whit laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. You got family waitin', Nell. Maybe the world ain't all lost. Nell nodded, clutching the letter, breathless with hope and sorrow. That night the rain picked up again, drumming the roof till it sounded like 1,000 tiny hooves. Cade stayed on, tending the horses and checking the gates. Whit lit a lamp in the parlor, pulled his old Bible from the shelf, and read quiet by the fire. Nell sat with her knees drawn up, cross in one hand, the letter from her mother in the other, her eyes full of something ancient and wide as the prairie itself. Just before midnight there was a hard rap at the door. Whit opened it to find a deputy from Santa Fe, coat dripping, a look of business about him. He handed Whit a folded summons, the red seal unbroken. You're wanted in court, Santa Fe. Ellen McCrae. Marriage in question, property dispute, fraud claims. Best come ready. Whit nodded, jaw set. The deputy tipped his hat and vanished into the rain. Nell read the summons, lips pressed white, and for a moment it seemed all the warmth in the house had been snuffed out. But as the rain softened to mist, Cade pulled a tin of coffee from his saddlebag and set to making a fresh pot. Ain't over, he said, voice calm as always. Not while you're still, here to stand and tell it straight. Whit clapped him on the back. We'll stand with her, hell or high water. The three of them sat up late, talking little, letting the fire burn low. Nell held the cross and the letter close, whispering her mother's name into the quiet. Outside, the world washed itself clean, at least for a night. When dawn came, the rain was gone and the hills glimmered fresh and green, but the summons sat on the table like a coiled snake. They packed quietly, bread, beans, coffee, Nell's cross, and her mother's letter. Cade rode ahead, scouting the road to Santa Fe, rifle across his lap, eyes sharp for trouble. Before leaving, Whit set 2 bowls at the table, one for himself, one for the sister he'd thought lost. He paused, hand resting on the wood, then left the door unlocked behind him. Some things, he reckoned, needed to find their own way home. Santa Fe lay farther than miles. The road wound through cottonwood groves, then up to high mesas where the wind never stopped. Nell rode between Cade and Whit in the buckboard, eyes fixed on the horizon, the cross cold in her hand. She hardly spoke the whole journey, her thoughts turning with every wheel, every rattle over stone. A past she barely remembered, a future the law could still steal. They reached the city at dusk, gold lights spilling across adobe walls. the streets alive with a different kind of dust and hunger. The courthouse stood at the center, thick-walled and stern, men with badges and sharp collars waiting on its steps. Whit helped Nell down, Cade trailing behind, face unreadable but never far from her side. Inside, the room was wide and cold, the walls lined with faces that watched and judged. Judge Merriweather presided, a man with a gray beard and dark eyes that missed nothing. The Rutledge lawyer, Cobb, paced in front of the rail, waving papers, his voice sharp as a whip. This woman, Ellen McCrae, married under false pretense, took land, forged her name, lied about her kin. The law demands justice. Nell stood straight, dress clean but plain, hair braided back. Cade was there at her right, boots planted, arms folded. Whit stood behind, his shadow long in the lamplight. The judge looked over his spectacles. "Well, Miss McCrae, what do you say?" Nell's voice was quiet but carried. "I was taken as a child, sold from house to house. The only thing I kept was this cross. My name's in the San Isidro church record. The preacher can swear it. My mama's letter—" She held it up, hands trembling. "Matches every fact. I married for safety, not land." Cobb sneered. "How convenient." Cade stepped forward, voice low and certain. "You got all the proof you need in that cross and that letter. She's the only honest thing in this room." Judge Merriweather leaned forward. "What would you say, Mr. Mercer, if we stripped you both of the land, your house, your name?" Cade didn't flinch. "I'd still stand by her. Before her, I had 4 walls and silence. Now I got something worth losing." The room fell quiet. The only sound was Nell's breath, shaky but sure. Whit stared at the floor, fists clenched. In the back, Alma Reyes, the old Rose widow, stood and nodded. Rosita Pike, small but fierce, called out, "I saw how they treated her. She was no one's property. She fed us when they left us hungry." The judge listened. His pen tapped the desk. "This is a court of law, not of sentiment, but facts weigh heavy." He shuffled the papers, then fixed Cobb with a cold stare. "I see no fraud here. Marriage stands. Land stands. For now. But I'll investigate further. Mr. Rutledge is not above the law, no matter how many seals he buys." A shudder of relief rippled through the room. Cobb gathered his papers, eyes burning. The judge banged his gavel. Court adjourned, pending review. Outside, the air felt lighter. Whit clapped Cade on the back. Cade tipped his hat to Nell, and Nell, her hand shaking, let herself believe for a moment that maybe justice could belong even to those who'd never dared hope for it. They walked the street under the first stars, the summons still in Whit's coat, but their heads higher than when they'd arrived. For one night, Santa Fe felt less like a place you had to run from, and more like a place where you might, someday, be allowed to stay. The next morning, Nell woke early in the boarding house room, sunlight climbing the adobe wall. She lay there, cross in her palm, the memory of her mother's letter replaying in her head like a tune she'd nearly forgotten. Cade was already up, boots thudding in the hall, the scent of coffee seeping under the door. Whit sat at the window, hat tipped low, watching the square below for trouble, or perhaps for hope. Downstairs, Rosita Pike was waiting with a roll of bread and a news scrap. "You got mail, Miss Nell," she said, eyes wide. The note was unsigned, just a single line scrawled in a hand she didn't know. "You're not who you think you are. Ash Mesa holds the truth. R.T." Whit frowned, reading it over her shoulder. "Sounds like a rattler. You sure you want to poke that hill?" Nell tucked the note into her skirt, determination glinting behind the worry. "I need to know. Every page of my life's got someone else's handwriting on it. I want to find mine." They left Santa Fe before midday, borrowing a mule cart from Alma Reyes. Cade drove, Rosita came along, saying she wouldn't miss the ride for all the churros in New Mexico. Ash Mesa lay north, a hump of pale stone and scattered sage, wind singing through fence posts and the ruins of old houses. They followed the road past the river, up through scrub and broken fences to a half-buried sign, Our Lady of Sorrow's Home. Only a low foundation and the stump of a well remained. The air tasted of dust and old prayers. Nell walked slow, her boots trailing in the weeds, hands shaking as she searched. It was Cade who found the tin box, half buried near the well, rusted nearly through. He pried it open with his pocket knife. Inside were brittle papers, a faded photo, children lined up, a tall woman behind, her face in shadow. On the back, transferred to Rutledge, 1866, Ellen McCrae. Nell's knees buckled. Whit caught her. Rosita held the picture, lip trembling. There were ledgers, lists of names, and at the bottom, a letter written in a spidery hand. I took money. I moved girls for men with heavy purses. If you read this, I'm sorry. I remember the one with the broken lullaby. I remember your cross. I should have fought for you harder. Nell pressed her forehead to the box. All this time I thought I was lost by accident. I was sold. Her voice shook but didn't break. But somebody remembered. Whit laid a hand on her shoulder, silent. Cade looked away, jaw tight, as if holding back the urge to burn the world down. The four of them sat there in the grass, the wind hissing through the sage, letting the truth settle. Sometimes it takes a field of ghosts to see how far you've walked alone. They left Ash Mesa slow, the box and the photo wrapped in a scarf, the letter folded with her mother's. Nell stared out at the horizon, cross cold in her hand, her name, her real name, growing solid as the land itself. Back at the ranch, the world felt different, sharper at the edges. Nell stood on the porch at dusk, watching the sky turn violet and gold. You all right? Cade asked, voice gentle. Nell nodded, tears drying on her cheeks. I'm not lost anymore, I'm just not done finding. Whit joined them, pipe in hand, Rosita humming by the window. For a while, nobody spoke. It was enough to be together, even if the world outside was still waiting to press its claim. Sunrise brought a cold snap, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and with it, the sound of hooves on packed earth. Steady, measured, not the frantic gallop of trouble, but the arrival of someone who knew their place and meant to claim it. Whit was the first to spot the rider at the gate. Tall in the saddle, black coat, hat pulled low, a presence that quieted the dogs and sent the horses into watchful silence. He tied his horse with slow purpose and strode to the porch. Nell was already there, the box from Ash Mesa resting in her lap. Cade close at her side, Whit behind them like a wall. The stranger tipped his hat, revealing gray eyes as cold as January. Name's Reed Tyrell, he said, voice deep, polite as a funeral, but just as heavy. Folks call me RT. I got questions, need answers. Nell rose, lifting her chin, cross glinting at her throat. If you come for the Rutledge claim, you'll be disappointed. RT shook his head. I ain't with Rutledge. I'm kin distant, but kin enough to know when a name don't fit. You say you're Nell McCrae, but papers got gaps. Ash Mesa has more ghosts than records. He produced a tintype photo, old, silvered at the edges. A girl, maybe 5, standing with others, a ribbon in her hair. My sister Lark was taken too, never found her. All I got left is memory and this picture. His hand trembled a little as he handed it over. Nell studied the photo, her own childhood too fogged by loss to find certainty. She searched her heart for the truth, but all she could offer was what she carried. I was Ellen. I was June. Now I'm Nell because it's the only name that ever felt like home. I don't want to take what's yours. I just want to be allowed to stay. RT gazed at her, eyes searching. For a long moment, no one moved. Cade shifted, ready for violence, but Whit only watched, measuring the stranger's pain against their own. Finally, R.T. bowed his head, voice soft. "You're not my Lark, but you're kin all the same. You carry the scars, you carry the song. That's enough for me." He laid the tintype on the porch rail. "I prayed for the wrong name. I'm sorry for the pain it's caused." He looked to Whit. "Blood ain't always in the vein, is it?" Whit shook his head. "No, sir. Sometimes it's just in the staying." R.T. nodded once, then tipped his hat to Nell, Cade, and Whit, and walked back to his horse. "You keep that picture," he called over his shoulder. "A piece of the past for whoever needs it most." Then he rode out, shadow long and straight behind him, leaving a hush in his wake. Nell sat hard on the step, clutching the photo and the cross. For a moment she let herself cry, not just for the sister she never was, but for all the lost ones, Lark, herself, every child sold and renamed and nearly forgotten. Cade settled beside her, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders, steady as the land itself. Inside, Whit lit a fire, the old habit of making warmth for whoever was left. Outside, the world waited, quieter for now, as if even the wind had been given pause by what had just passed on the porch. For the first time in years, Nell found herself breathing easy. The truth might never come tidy, but it had found a home. Spring pressed gently into the valley, coaxing pecan buds from bare branches and sending the last of winter's frost deep into memory. At Dry Arrow Ranch, the world felt new and old all at once, every morning alive with the lowing of calves, the hush of cottonwoods, and the soft clatter of bowls in the kitchen before sunup. Nell, who had once been Ellen and June, now wore the name Lark when she signed the grain orders, and there was no more shame in the word. She moved through each day with a quiet purpose, rising before dawn to kindle the stove and set 2 bowls on the table. One for Whit, one for the girl she'd been, who would never leave her. Whit grew older by the fire, pipe in hand, watching the ranch run smoother than he'd ever hoped. Sometimes he caught himself looking for trouble out the window, expecting old shadows on the horizon, but mostly he found peace, watching Lark and Cade brush the horses under the new green, Alma tending roses out front, Rosita's laughter drifting from the back porch. Cade Mercer, steady as ever, spent his days building fences and his nights beside Lark, holding her hand in the quiet after supper. He didn't say much, but his presence spoke every word she needed. "You belong. You are safe. I ain't going nowhere." Sometimes late, he'd push the old wooden swing under the cottonwood. Lark perched on the seat, hair loose in the dusk. In those moments, she let herself feel it all. The pain, the loss, the wonder of being here at all. There were troubles, always. Rutledge men tried once more to send letters, but the law stood firm, thanks to Marshal Bennett and Judge Merriweather. Briggs was caught and put on a train out of the territory. Dry Arrow Ranch no longer stood alone. Neighbors came with casseroles and stories, and even old Alma planted a new row of rose bushes along the fence. In the kitchen, Rosita and Lark would hum together, kneading dough, the air warm with cinnamon and hope. Some days Lark found herself wandering out to the grave marker near the cottonwoods, a simple stone for the lost girls, for Lark's own former selves. She'd kneel there, fingers pressed to the earth, and whisper, "Thank you, not just to God, but to Whit, to Cade, to the whole broken, beautiful world that had given her a place to belong." One afternoon, as rain ticked gently on the barn roof, Cade found her at the window, arms wrapped around herself, gaze soft on the hills. He stepped behind, pulling the old shawl around her shoulders, his hand reverent on her arm. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, letting herself lean into his warmth. "I think so," she said, voice quiet as falling rain. "For the first time, I really think so." He kissed her hair, and for a while they stood there, letting peace fill the space where fear used to live. That night after supper, Lark lit a candle and placed it on the porch. She set out 2 bowls. One for now, one for the memory of every girl who'd ever been lost and found. Whit joined her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I ever tell you," he said, "you saved this place as much as I did." She smiled. "I didn't do it alone." He squeezed her hand. "Nobody ever does." As the stars came out, Rosita danced in the yard, Alma hummed a hymn, and Cade swung Lark gentle under the cottonwood tree. The silver cross glimmered at her throat, steady now, no longer shaking. Home was no longer a question, but an answer she wore every day. When the night grew cool and the lamp burned low, Lark whispered into the hush, "I ain't leavin'." Not now, not ever. The wind seemed to carry the words out across the pasture, to every empty place she'd ever known. And in that stillness, the past and present stitched themselves together, not perfect, but whole enough to stay. If this story struck a chord, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still out there, or just say 0 if you think you'd have done the same. Don't forget to hit subscribe for more tales from the Old West. There's always another story riding in come sunrise. Stick around, partner. See you on the next trail.